And what an exciting and profound guest we have today discussing on the topic of imagining the world after COVID-19. It is really a pleasure and honor to have such a formidable panelist and Dr. Abid and our listeners and audience. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce our esteemed panel comprised of Professor Dr. Adil Najjar, who is the inaugural Dean of the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. And he's also a professor of international relations and of earth and environment. Earlier, Professor Dr. Adil Najjar served as Vice Chancellor of the Lahore University of Management Sciences in Lahore. His research focuses on research of global public policy, especially those related to global climate change, South Asia, Muslim countries, environment and development, and human development also. In 2010, he has awarded the Sitara Imtiaz, one of Pakistan's highest civil awards by the President of Pakistan. In 2019, he was appointed to the Prime Minister of Pakistan Advisory Council on Foreign Affairs. Professor Najjar was a co-author for the third and fourth assessments of the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, which worked for the scientific panel. In 2008, he was invited by the United Nations Secretary General to serve on the Climate UN Committee on Development. We have Dr. Abid Qayyum Suleri, who is the Executive Director of Sustainable Development Policy Institute. He is the member of different policy making forums and advisory boards, including Prime Minister Economic Advisory Council, Pakistan Climate Change Council, National Advisory Committee of Planning Commission of Pakistan, National Coordination Committee on Agriculture Transformation. He is also heading agriculture universities as the Vice Chancellor Search Committee, Government of Punjab, and the Ministry of Planning, Development and Reforms, Ministry of Finance, and Ministry of Climate Change, among others. He is also serving on different international policy-making forums, including Advisory Board of Intergovernment Organizations, Think Tanks Network, and co-chair of the Board of Climate Action Network South Asia. Yeah. So without any further ado, I would like to pass podium to Dr. Abid Qayyum Suleri. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending from where our online viewers they have logged in. Adil's talk is being live streamed on our social media pages, including STPI's web TV and our Facebook Live, and I know there are quite a few who have already joined. First of all, I'll like to express thanks and welcome Adil Najjar for his annual ritual, which was somehow missed last year. Last year you were at part of our SGC though. So Adil has a tradition के हर साल का जो आखिरी लेक्चर या अगले साल का जो पहला लेक्चर होता है वो STPI उनका ऑर्गेनाइज करती है पाकिस्तान में, और इस साल भी हम इस ट्रेडिशन को बरकरार रखना चाह रहे थे. So thanks Adil for joining us, and I can assure you that whatever you would be discussing today, that would be food for thought for us, especially the researchers at STPI, so that they can plan their research agenda accordingly for the year 2022. और दूसरा मुझे एम्बेसडर नदीम रियाज साहब का शुक्रिया अदा करना था. बहुत शॉर्ट नोटिस पे IRS ने इसको होस्ट किया. कल ही मेरी इनसे बात हुई. पहले हम इसको ऑनलाइन आदिल की टॉक जो है उसको होस्ट करना चाह रहे थे, बट देन आई स्टार्टेड रिसीविंग कॉल्स फ्रॉम पीपल दैट दे वांटेड टू अटेंड इन पर्सन. तो मैंने एम्बेसडर साहब से रिक्वेस्ट की, एंड एम्बेसडर साहब वाज एक्सट्रीमली अकोमोडेटिव, और उन्होंने आज हमें मौका दिया कि STPI से बाहर IRS में आके हम इस टॉक का जो है एहतमाम वो कर सके. तो इंशाल्लाह इस सिलसिला को हम वक्तन फ़वक्तन जारी रखेंगे ताकि थोड़ी सी एक चेंज जो है वो STPI के सेमिनार्स में हो. So Adil, floor is yours, and of course I'll be sitting there and watching your very thought-provoking slides and listening to you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Ji. Thank you very much. My gratitude to everyone for being here. मैं पहले टेक्नोलॉजी देख लूं कि हमारी चल रही है कि नहीं, and then we will start. But it is always a great pleasure to be here. Jaise Abid just said, it's become an annual ritual. I don't know how many years it's been, Abid. 7 or 8 at least. So for the last 7 or 8 years, right at the end of the year or at the beginning of the year, because I usually visit, it's become something that I look forward to. And I have always used these occasions to talk not just about things that I'm talking about elsewhere, but to talk about something new. So a number of things that I have worked since then have really started as my SDPI talks. आपका sound का ठीक है जी? Huh? So please guide me. I have a few slides that have sound, so I will work with our AV team on that. But as I said, I have used this occasion to think of something new, and today is really new. In fact, ये आज वाली जो talk है, Abid, this is really the first time I'm giving that. So it's a little complicated technically, but I hope it is interesting otherwise. And it also relates to the theme of your annual SDC, which I was unfortunately not able to attend. So for all of those reasons, I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm especially grateful to RIS also for hosting it, but for all of you who are here, and it's good to see real people and to know that real people still exist. And real people can still smile behind their masks and sometimes outside. And also it's very grateful to all the people who might be following online. So that's the goal. Before I start, Abid, if you allow me, this थोड़ी सी company की मशहूरी भी मैं करूँगा, लेकिन I'll come to that. I have 3 questions. This is work that I have done last year, right as COVID began, and I'll talk about that. But the real thing I want to talk about is what might the world look like after COVID? And I'll tell you the answer I'll come to. The world after COVID, aa nahi raha, aa gaya. So we don't really have to, but what might be the changes? And there are 3 questions that I want you to think of. And you will see that I've put, if you can look at the slide, some words in red. But the first is to think about. One is, what did COVID change? Badlaya ki? What did COVID change and what did it not change? And I think it is instinctive, knee-jerk that we say कि जी सब कुछ बदल गया या कुछ नहीं बदला, but to think somewhat systematically that what changed, what did not. The second is, when will the world get back to normal? And you note that I put the word normal in quotes, and I'll tell you my conclusion right now. The world wasn't normal before COVID. ऐसा नहीं था कि the world in January of 2020 was some amazing place, which was utopia. In fact, my guess is that whether it is RIS or SDPI or ISSS, where I was speaking an hour ago, you were all talking probably in January about what a messed up place the world was. So thinking about normal is itself an important idea. कि पहले तो ये तय करना है ये normal होता क्या? And then we talk about whether we get there or not. So that's the second question I want to raise. And the third question I want to raise is, what can we learn from crisis, including whether we as a species are yet evolved enough to learn. Are we a learning species? I'm saying that not entirely facetiously, but in that way. So those are the 3 sort of questions that I want us to sort of think about. And as I think about that, if you allow me, वो जो मैं company की मशहूरी की बात कर रहा था, नहीं वो शायद बाद में आ रहा. I'm going to tell you a story that's told to me by 99 really smart people. So this is rest my story and what I've heard in this piece of research, where I ended up talking to 99 really smart people I respect from all across the world, and we put this one question to them. सिर्फ एक सवाल कि in the area you work in, how do you think the world after COVID will be? That was the only question, and we had essentially 5 minutes. And you will hear from some of them if we can get our technology going right. अच्छा ये slide थोड़ी सी गड़बड़ हो गई, ये मेरा कसूर है. But anyhow, let me run that past. Then let me run that past. So I will skip that slide and I will go to the next one. So as I said, the story is this story of what these people tell. Now, let me tell you the story of the story. The story of the story is that it began with me not knowing what I was doing, which is how most good stories start. So COVID happens, jaise aapke saath hua hai, probably mere saath bhi, we all thought, ke, yaar, ye kya ho gaya? Then we thought, okay, this might take a little time, but we didn't really think very deep about it. So I was in Boston and I am the Dean of the School of International Affairs. I also have one of our centers that I've been the acting director of. The center is called the Center for the Study of the Future. So we look at future trends and we thought, कि यार, we should look at what this will do. Right? So हमने एकदम पहले क्लासें अपनी online की, we started wearing masks and sort of, we changed to look at what this COVID world might look at. And we thought we would go and start talking to some people. But before that, as I said, the whole university, just like all of Pakistan, STPI, went online. And we started wearing masks, we started learning Zoom. Clearly, we haven't fully learned how to use Zoom, but these pictures that you see was me teaching. And because we were teaching in hybrid, students were in the room, which were outside. One good thing was that you could change your background every time to match the lecture you were giving. This is my class on sustainable development. So with that little panga out of the way, the thing we did on the COVID was that for the center, I asked my staff, yaar, ye karte hain, कि we'll talk to 4 or 5 really smart people. And we'll ask them this question. And we'll record it on Zoom and we'll put out the videos. Right? The type of thing everyone was also doing. Now, by the time it ended, it turned out that instead of 4 or 5 people, because we thought this was 3 months, 5 months, 6 months, instead of 3 or 4 people, it turned into 99 people. And instead of a few weeks, it turned into 7 months. We ended at 101. So at 101, we just stopped, not because we were out of people or out of ideas, but you had to stop at some point. And what I want to do today, and these were really interesting people, you'll see some of them. The last one, the reason it became 101 was that the Secretary General of the United Nations said yes right at the last minute. So we said, usse pehle we had the Prime Minister of Italy, we had the former head of NATO forces, Admiral Stavridis, we had about 7 or 8 Nobel winners. We had people from all across the world. We had the head of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn. We had Noam Chomsky. But luckily, because of COVID, people also had time. Plus, they were interested in this question. And that's really the thing that happened. The thing that happened is I suddenly found that this question sparks interest. And suddenly everyone was interested. And what was interesting was not what the answer was, but just asking the question opened this thing. And suddenly we found that we were all over the international sort of media. STPI was very, very kind to host one of those with us. But in languages, jo mujhe aati nahi hai, and then languages I didn't even know, we were being reported in Catalan, Spanish, French, वगैरह तो थी. But suddenly this question took on a life. And what I want to do today, I'm sorry I'm going into the background, but the background is important because it was a surprise. All of this was a surprise. The fact that we ended up at 101 was a surprise. The fact that there was this intense media interest and across the globe was a surprise. And what we found was also part of the surprise. So what I want to do today is to share some of this, and that's why the audio part is important. Life after COVID, jo hai, what were we learning? Let me put the big lessons first. They might sound simple, but they are not. So I turned it into a number of pieces, and this is from there. The first lesson that we learned very early on, दूसरे तीसरे, कि change ऐसे नहीं होती कि there is something and then it stops and then something new comes. That's not how change happens. Change invariably happens that there are lots of things already in the mix, and then some shock comes, in this case COVID, a world war, a disease, something else, and the changes that are already in the system accelerate. Right? So essentially the things that we have seen with COVID, everyone was telling us, and now we are seeing, are not things that happened new. They are things that were already happening, but the pace of change suddenly changed. It's not कि हमें Zoom पहले नहीं करना था. It's not कि हम पहले Skype नहीं करते थे. It's not कि हम remote काम नहीं कर सकते थे. Right? It's not even कि mask नहीं थे. But suddenly something comes that changes the need to do something, and that need creates a habit, right? And a lot of these habits, I'll come to that, stay. And that's actually the big challenge. The big challenge becomes, okay, which of these habits will stay? Because habits are very difficult to form. Habits are even more hard to unform, right? And especially for people who work on what's happening to the workplace, to how people do work. That's a major area. Now, in politics, this is exactly the same thing. A lot of it was on politics. I'm the dean of an international affairs school, so a lot of this was international affairs. But a lot of it was the disruption to democracy. It's not actually a disruption, but the change to democracy hasn't happened because of COVID. It was already there, but it accelerates. My favorite example is, if you can push back in your mind, आपका जो भी video player है mind में, उसमें do a rewind to January of 2020, right? Last time I was giving this lecture. In fact, if you remember, Abid, the lecture I gave, उसमें मैंने जो तस्वीरें दिखाई थी वो क्या थी? If you go back to STPI, the lecture I gave at STPI, January 2020, the photographs I was showing, the photographs you were seeing, were essentially photographs from around the world of lots of angry people. Greta was angry on climate. And they were mostly angry young people. Angry young people in Lahore, angry young people in Jawaharlal Nehru University protesting in India, angry young people protesting in Chile, protesting, remember, in Lebanon, protesting, remember, in Hong Kong, Chhatriyan Pakad ke, protesting in the UK, Extinction Rebellion, protesting in Germany, right? There was this thing. And if you now roll back, you see a lot of the same very legitimate anger. And what I was talking was, they're angry for a reason. The promise made to them is not being fulfilled. The promise of climate isn't being fulfilled. The promise of democracy isn't being fulfilled. The promise of a good life isn't being fulfilled. There is anger across the globe. And we see some of that same anger sort of then, aisa nahi hai ki COVID aata hai to you just forget it. It changes its form. It changes its medium. And you start seeing the same sort of social movements that are now happening, for example, in the US, whether it is on race. You see the acceleration on climate and Greta and so on and so forth. So the point, without going too much into it, is that disruptions accelerate. Now, why is this important? You are saying, हाँ यार ये तो हमें भी पता था, obviously पता था, मुझे भी पता था, लेकिन मुझे realize तब नहीं. The thing is, for those of us, for example, who work on climate change, it's exactly the same thing. In some ways, if people are thinking a climate will change and new things will happen, that's not how it will change. Science has been telling us forever. What happens is that what is already happening changes in climate. For example, दो चीजें होती हैं, या उसका amplitude change हो जाता है, या उसकी frequency change हो जाती है, right? Remember your physics? या वो graph amplitude meaning things that were happening, the flood, the drought, the thing that was happening now happens at a higher amplitude, meaning more of it happens, or it happens with increasing frequency. The flood that was a 25-year flood becomes a 15-year flood. The drought that was supposed to be in Thar for 3 years stays on for 8. The heat wave in Karachi that used to come once in 10 years came 8 years ago and hasn't left. Right? And that's the nature of disruption, which COVID taught us. The second thing is that they were telling us, and remember, this is important. We were doing this in March of 2020 and did it in November. So COVID was still happening. It still is happening. They are telling us, our experts are telling us, politics will become more turbulent. Politics becomes more turbulent because of political issues, but the nature of politics, for anyone who studies democracy, this is very important. What they are telling us is COVID changes the nature of politics. What does that mean? What it means is that mostly you think of, let's say, in democratic entities, that people vote 4 times every 4 years. Right? Pakistan में election कितनी देर बाद होती है? 5 years? नहीं यार, अब कितनी देर बाद होती है? दिन में 5 बार होती है. Right? I mean, this is not a joke. So what COVID accelerated was what was already happening. What that phone did to you, or did to Imran Khan or Nawaz Sharif or everyone, is that you vote 5 times, 7 times a day. right? That changes the nature of politics. We might get annoyed about it or not, but we are the ones causing it. And therefore, the political response time changes. Now, this is not true only in Pakistan ka masla nahi hai, puri duniya mein aisa ho. Trump was the most epitome of this, multiple elections a day. Now, what does that do to international relations? It does the same thing. International relations, you used to have a conference, the conference would come to a conclusion, the conclusion would be typed out all night, next day someone would release it. Now you tweet it before you finish your speech. Right? So the pace of a lot of politics becomes not just more, but it becomes turbulent because there is more noise. Pandemic habits will persist. Right? Zoom is probably the best one. So SDPI goes to online. SDPI might come to hybrid. I am sure a lot of the online will remain. Right? People start working at remote. That doesn't mean कि आपका जब COVID खत्म होता है तो that goes away, because now the habits have formed in. Now you think about that societally, and the other habits also form in, right? So habits will persist. Again, ये broad है, but we'll come to this in a minute. And finally, crises will create opportunities, because crises always create opportunities. But opportunities also, every time you say an opportunity is created, that means someone is also losing. Right? ये जिस तरह मेरे जो दोस्त हैं IT वाले, आजकल it's been a good year. We talk a lot about how much it has gone to, for example, in Pakistan, let's say, but also in the US. Suddenly, people started. My bhabhi staying with my brother and my mother. It turned out वो कल अदरक ले रही थी online. I didn't realize कि online आप अदरक ले सकते, लेकिन वो ले रही थी. Right? And she said, it's more convenient, plus it is not much more expensive than wo Juma Bazaar, Sunday Bazaar. That may be true. But here is the thing. The fact that someone is able to now sell and deliver adrak online means that there is also another adrak wala who had a shop. Right? It's not as if all of this is new. So when opportunities are created for some people, there are other opportunities that might change for other people. We saw an immense creation of wealth, right? Because this was global with Amazon, right? We created more wealth for a certain set of companies in this COVID period than in the decade before that. That might be something to celebrate, but the question to ask is, wo wealth jo agar idhar se aayi hai, to what changed elsewhere? Right? And therefore the losers of COVID. I'm sorry I've gone through this a lot. So let me move to, and I'll need my help from my IT people. Let me give you some glimpses of what our people were saying and who these experts were. So I'll show you these 5 things. And the first of these is think about this idea of return. कि हम कहीं से return कर जाएंगे. There is, as if there is time, and at some point something happens and then you return back to a place. Right? That really doesn't happen. That really doesn't happen. So let me show you a literally 2-minute clip on this. अगर इसका आप मुझे audio दे दें.
Single activity that goes on as it once did.
We'll see disparities emerge among those who are connected and those who are not. Being disconnected in the world of COVID was bad.
There will not be a single sector of society untouched by this pandemic. There will not be a single activity that goes on as it once did.
We'll see disparities emerge among those who are connected and those who are not. Being disconnected in the world of COVID was bad. Being disconnected after the world of COVID will be worse.
I think one thing that COVID has done is it's brought technology into spaces where it never was before.
As a result of COVID-19, we're going to have robots everywhere. Everywhere.
I think every business will be a digital business.
Zoom has become a verb. The question is how this will change our working lives.
This whole notion of work from home while it's been really good for a lot of people, I do think we need to be very cautious and pay a lot of attention to what's happening in particular for women.
Is every university going to become Zoom university in the future?
I think we can be really clear and say that global higher education will change profoundly, and I do think it will change forever.
This is going to be a long-term recovery effort, trying to rebuild cities in a way that emphasizes health, safety, inclusivity, justice, and resilience. That's where I think we have to go.
I hope that literature could give us the logic and the feeling to really strive for communitarian bonds.
This moment is helping us realize how important and key and necessary the arts are to our very core being.
I think more people will appreciate the primacy of public health as the undergirding of our civil society.
We have an opportunity here to break down the barriers that continue to haunt our discussion about mental health.
There are things that could be done. There's no reason why we can't rise to the level of other developed countries, and indeed many underdeveloped ones, and introduce a humane system of universal health care.
Epidemics bring out the worst and the best in people. People become threatened, they become worried. But then there are people who see a fire and they take a bucket and they run towards it. Epidemics at least give us hope that there is this higher level that we can all aspire to.
I don't know if the sound came out okay to you, but if not, then I'll stop using the sound and just give you the summary. But some of the things that were said there that were very important. One was this thing that I think we will talk about a lot of time that has surprised me. In a way, COVID has created a new class system. And we might be thinking that we are very sort of right-minded in the class system. Like if you are in this room, and especially if you are listening to me online, you are part of that class system and some of the challenges, which means कि आपका class system था ना rich poor का या caste का या location का या language का. The new class system that has emerged from COVID very dominantly, which I don't think people were thinking about, is the class system of those who work on screens and those who didn't work on screens. ये कहानी मेरे लिए कहना बड़ा अच्छी है जी कि मैं तो घर पे आराम से काम कर सकता हूँ. That first requires I have a screen. The second requires I have a ghar. Right? Now, this is not just a Pakistani thing. This is very global. What happened in COVID? Some of us said we really care about our life. We are going to put on a mask, and someone is going to deliver me my adrak. And then there was someone who had to deliver the adrak and get to 5 places before he delivers it to you. Right? There were people in restaurants, there were people in grocery stores. In a way, what happened, and in the write-up, when I write about it, I talk about it, what happened here was similar to what happened after 9/11 to airline workers. I don't know if you, for those of you who travel a lot, airline, just staff hota tha na, stewards inko kehte hain, stewardesses, that totally changed. Suddenly, instead of having a fun job that allowed you to see the world, you were frontline worker in a possibly dangerous profession, right? And you saw that very clearly. And similarly, being in a restaurant as server meant ke jo kabhi kbar ghar se nikal ke apna maas shaas family ke sath hota time kar raha hai. But the people who are serving are now frontline workers who are going to take on the risk of everyone who's coming there, take it back to their homes. And what we are seeing in both Europe and especially in the US is the clash of this class. At the university, we are changing rules to do remote work. So we have announced that anyone will do about 2 days of work remotely. And that has erupted a major employee issue. Right? It's good for people. Well, it's good for some people because there are certain tasks that are not going to happen like that. There are certain other people who are going to sort of take that on. So that class system that she was talking about, and I hope again, what sound clear tha ya nahi chal raha? Then let me move on. So that's return. Now I put this picture for a reason. And I put this picture in change because one of the other things that suddenly, पहले SDPI में 2-4 लोग होते थे जो इसकी बात करते थे, बाकियों को नहीं ये लफ्ज ही नहीं पता था, was suddenly everyone started talking about it around the world, was supply chain. Right? We didn't realize कि यार ये supply chain का क्या कहानी होती है, कोई होता होगा technical सी चीज. Suddenly it became a really important thing. I'll tell you how important. In my university, we're a major university, we are major buyers of computers. The backlog on an Apple computer or a ThinkPad was 8 months. People I hired in June were getting their computers now. That's what a supply chain means. And the supply chain questions on this was, ya wo hota hai, ya price change hoti hai. So let us hear some thoughts, and I hope people can listen in. Agar usko aap
society will be transformed, I think, permanently. And this notion of returning to status quo ante is, I think, not possible.
I think that the level of shakeup in our global economy is going to be the most serious challenge civilization has faced in 300 or 400 years.
If you look at the responses to this crisis, it is often going to lead to an incredible increase in the levels of debt that households, governments, and corporations are going to have.
When you're hit with something like Corona, which is simultaneously a demand and supply shock, and it continues in waves, this type of growth model that's based on consumption is a disaster.
How does the EU solve the problem of the pandemic economic crisis and also pull itself out of the Eurozone crisis?
The big question that I wish we had an answer for, and so far I don't think we have an answer for, is where will the good jobs come from?
Developing countries need to find as much fiscal space as they can possible. They are fighting the virus. Their debt is ballooning. They're also losing remittances, which many countries rely on.
I would not expect many developing countries to get to 2019 levels of income by 2025.
One positive thing that has come out of this crisis might be to make developing countries more self-confident and make them seek their own ways.
If you said 40 years ago that inequality would have gotten a lot worse, people would have said, well, there'll be a revolution. Maybe it'll get worse still and there won't be a revolution. Maybe this time will be too much.
A society that wants to deal with inequality, poverty, and injustice can, but it does mean you have to reduce the extreme, obscene levels of wealth in comparison to the extreme levels of poverty.
We need to develop an economic system, an international economic order, and a regulation of globalization that brings us to a more equitable and also sustainable development model for the future.
I hope that that you could hear this. There were some very sort of heavy-hitter people there, like Piketty and stuff. But the two themes you would put on is one. You saw Angus Deaton. I don't know how many people. I hope people know about Angus Deaton. Angus Deaton is Nobel winner in economics. He's most famous for his book, The Great Escape, and he's sort of one of the optimist people, right? The Great Escape for what the work he got the Nobel for is essentially that countries have actually escaped poverty. People have actually escaped short lives. Countries have actually escaped disease, right? They can escape more, they can do better. But the great story of the last 300 years, according to him, is a story of escape. But even he, at least in the beginning of COVID, when we were doing this, was sort of really, really worried. Or you heard Atif Mia talking about debt and the others talking about debt. And we'll come back to debt in a minute. Now, one of the things that is talking today in December of 2021, you see actually also a lot of prosperity happening, right? Companies actually doing extremely well, whether it is Amazon and a lot of online new monies coming into online and IT in Pakistan and so on and so forth. The debt question hasn't gone away. The way we have done well, the reason Amazon, for example, has done well is countries started printing money. Right, you are seeing that in the inflation you are seeing now, but you are seeing that in debt additions now in the US. I'll come back to this in a moment. I'll say this again then, let me say it then. In the US printed $1 trillion. Trillion. कितने सिफरे होते हैं trillion में? मुझे तो पता भी नहीं. Never seen $1 trillion. You print $1 trillion in 1 week. You spend $1 trillion in 9 days. In 9 days, it was finished. Right? At some point, economies are going to ask, कि यार, अच्छा ये जो हुआ था, इसका कोई तो result होगा ना. Again, this is really not a political thing, but a lot of the economic questions that are being asked in Pakistan today, whether they are inflation, whether they are others, I find it surprising that we are not also linking the COVID effect. Because in that monetary, but so the change that we are talking about is not just the change that was there, but the change, it is partly the change that was there, and then what happens because of the things we do to manage the change. So that was about economy. I'll show a couple more and then I'll come to my points. This idea of normal, right? This idea that there was a normal world. And I've already put my major point there. No one believed in normal. I gave when our students graduate as dean, I have to give this speech, which is kind of nice, their graduation speech. And my graduation speech last time was essentially on the theme, may you never go back to normal. Normal is not a good place. Or what we now think was normal was not a good place, right? And this is where you build back better, build forward better, your conference. But what does that mean? It's not an easy thing to do. So what were we hearing on this normal in terms of
I've never seen a period in which the degree of uncertainty.
Okay. So this one is in terms of politics. Sorry. Normal and what they were hearing on politics.
I've never seen a period in which the degree of uncertainty as to what the world will look like politically is greater than it is today.
What COVID-19 has done is to confirm the long-term trend of the return of Asia.
Human society and history tends to pick up on 3 or 4 different topics that affect us all. One is disease. It's part of our global history. One is on climate. One is natural resources. And one is on demographics. So right now, China sits in the middle of all of those kinds of questions.
COVID-19 really revealed, I think, a number of uncomfortable truths about the United States and China and their relationship.
Underlying fundamental structural lucidity and rivalry in which a rapidly rising China is seriously threatening to displace the US.
Security. The EU is in a very bad neighborhood, and that also links to the migrant and refugee crisis.
One of the effects that we see is fear of migrants ramping up.
I have been surprised how suddenly we are now concerned more about how many masks a country has as opposed to how much oil or energy.
There should be a conversation about what should be the definition of national security in the 21st century.
I think for the United States, alliances become more important. NATO becomes more important.
It's very clear that because of COVID, the United States is going to leave the Middle East. We have to expect that some governments in the Middle East will fall.
Already, we've seen a number of African countries that have suspended elections. And I can promise you, I can guarantee you that there will be many more countries in 2020 that do suspend their elections.
This US election is the most important exercise of the democratic franchise anywhere in the world, I would say, for the last 90 years at least.
It's embarrassing how terribly America has addressed this problem.
I think it's very important for the next president of the United States to really try to heal what has happened to our country.
The world after COVID is going to look an awful lot like the world before COVID.
I hope it went through sound-wise, but what you hear there, some very serious people in politics, the rate of acceleration of existing trends might have been the most prominent. Right now, again, we were doing this, as I said, in 2020. So this was the context of the US election coming. So a number of people were really focused on that, particularly given that it was Trump or no Trump. And that was a big question for the whole world, but it is more than that. Right? The rise of China, not the rise of China, but the rise of conflict or tension between China and the US clearly was accelerated by COVID. Now, clearly it was there before, but in some ways it enabled both countries to change strategy. China, which had been on a strategic path, time is on our hand. Ole ole rakho, we are gaining, and once we gain at the right time, we can proceed. In comes COVID and in comes Trump, and the US strategy also changes that, okay, if they want time, maybe it is better for us to accelerate it and bring the tension earlier than the equality. Now, this is not about sort of which way the politics ends up on. What it means is that something like COVID allowed an acceleration of that. The democracy points I've already made, but again, this idea that there was a normal that was not a normal, and that not normal has been accelerated and has been made permanent by COVID is where the argument is going. And that argument therefore means that whatever post-COVID normal comes in is not going to be that normal, right? And that's where the opportunity is. That's where the opportunity is, that how do you make that? Now, in terms of democracy, I particularly think it's one of those seminal moments. Now, I don't want this to be taken wrong, please. Democracy ko question nahi kar raha koi. It's not like people are saying democracy is not right and we should have autocracy or military governments. That's not what's being said. What's being said by young people on the streets across the world, as well as what's being said in the light of COVID, is that the form of democracy that we have come to understand as a 4-year electoral period is no longer fit for purpose in the way the world has evolved. Right? And that's the challenge that many places in the world is seeing. I again hope the sound is coming. I'll show you one more, which is on whether we learn or we don't learn, but this one is related to governance.
Just the sheer pathetic lack of leadership. Global leadership. I hear a lot of voices now talking about the death of the UN.
The biggest mistake that the Western countries have been making has been to weaken institutions of global governance, when in fact we needed stronger institutions of global governance.
Where is the global response? What is the global response? There isn't a global response.
Unfortunately, we are living in a world where multilateralism, symbolized and represented by the United Nations, is under serious attack.
The fact that institutions must evolve, must be reformed, is without question. The UN is not a perfect project, but a project it is.
My fear is that we go into some dystopian nightmare of super individualism. In reality, it's not going to work.
The leaders of the world really need to rethink sovereignty. Sovereignty can't be an absolute.
I don't think business as usual will be the result, as much as countries want that.
There's clearly a retreat from the kind of hyper-globalized world economy that we've built since the 1990s.
Do we see an end to globalization? No, but we will see basically a version 2.0, which will have a much more strategic character.
We need to collaborate to meet 21st century challenges, to manage what I call the butterfly defect of globalization. And yet what we're seeing is an increasing political fragmentation, indeed the danger of a Cold War 2.0.
I think people will realize as never before how important it is to have a capable state.
The countries that have gotten this right don't fall into any one category. It's not big or small countries. It's not rich or poor countries, nor is it democratic or authoritarian countries. It's really about countries that have leadership.
This time is time not for fearful leaders.
An international system which is directed, designed for the interests of people, not private power. It's not easy to attain, but it's possible.
Very major. I'll come back to the point about multilateralism because that's a major part of my final conclusion. So let me leave that. But the other things that you're thinking about hearing here, globalization has clearly changed. Now, again, a lot of the globalization change was already happening with Trumpism, with what was happening in Brexit and so on and so forth. But the challenges to globalization that had come already were exacerbated. Now that again one of the things it also showed, like in supply chains, is globalization is not going anywhere. The question is, what does globalization 2.0 look like? Right? And Chomsky, for example, is unusually optimistic. What he's saying, or Piketty was saying earlier, is that look, yaar, jab ye change aati hai na, when things go really berserk and you are feeling uncomfortable, that is also a moment to change something in the right direction. That status quo is not how change happens. If you want revolutionary change or a deep change, these moments of upheaval are in fact opportunities, not in the sense that usme koi win-win ho jayega ya koi low-hanging fruit ho jayega. It's not about low-hanging fruit, it's about the high-hanging fruit that becomes available when a flood aata. Right? Again, we are a flood-bearing nation, and Abid's work is on agriculture is very deep. Lekin floods jo hota hai, jo farmer hota hai, uske liye is an opportunity. It's also an opportunity in the sense, new soil comes. Things can be renewed and so on and so forth. So that's the really, and I'll show you one more, and then I'll come to the conclusions. And I purposely put this Lahore ki picture. Isme aap bahut kuch le ja sakte hain. I don't know wo gada hai ya ghoda hai. Lekin where is the gada or ghoda going in terms of the future, especially in terms of the type of issues that TPI particularly works on in terms of sustainable development. This is the last of my videos.
I don't think one can even mention sustainability unless you recognize that ecosystem health equals human health.
Humanity is placing too many pressures on the natural world, with damaging consequences.
What happens in the long term to biodiversity is going to depend on the course of our collapse.
We also need to make sure we prioritize a food future that coexists in harmony with nature.
The big problem, of course, is that problems of poverty and problems of inequality impinge on the question of food availability.
It's now the 21st century, and there are still 800 million people worldwide that don't have access to safe and affordable drinking water, and over 2 billion people worldwide that don't have access to adequate sanitation services. And even without a pandemic, even without a public health crisis, that is a public health crisis.
75 years from now, we're going to run the world on sun and wind because it's cheap and clean. But if it takes 75 years to get there, the world that we run on sun and wind will be a broken world.
We have many opportunities to really transform our economy as we come out of COVID.
We need to come back with a cleaner economy. We should be able to make our societies more resilient, grow the number of jobs, and actually grow the security of our energy system.
Do we prop up the fossil fuel industry? Or do we, as we did during the recession, choose to make an investment in green technologies?
You now have these extraordinary sums of money being mobilized overnight. We could not find it in ourselves for the past 10 years to find a way to mobilize $100 billion in order to accelerate our collective capacity to move towards a low-carbon economy.
We have another global pandemic, global planetary emergency looming. And can we use this opportunity, can we learn from this to actually fix the way for the future?
The coronavirus pandemic, in my view, is a harbinger of a much, much bigger emergency to come. And everybody is now seeing that.
The bottom line is that our recovery from this pandemic must guide us to a more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient future.
That goes back to your SDC idea, but the future is clearly dependent on the past, and the past wasn't a very good place, but there is the opportunity that you see there. I want you to remember what Achim Steiner, the head of UNDP, was saying. Okay, the surprise for him as well was for me was how easy it was to get money. ये जो लोग बोंगिया मारते हैं ना कि there isn't money, I've never believed that. Money is nearly never the issue. The issue is whether you want to spend the money or not, and I want to come to that. Now, I know I've thrown a lot at you, and I want to take your questions, but let me allow me 3 or 4 slides before I end and open up. So 2020, as you've heard, was a year like no other, right? We've talked about COVID. COVID wasn't the only thing happening. While we were all busy, putting our masks, doing our Zoom, buying Adrak online, what else was happening in the world? So let me remind you what else was happening in the world, and I'll come to my basic area of work. 2020 was a year like no other. What was the year doing other than COVID? It started in January, which was the hottest January ever recorded. Ever since we've recorded temperatures or climate, globally the hottest January. You might remember aapne retweet kiya hoga. Oh, bada bura hua, bada bura hua. And then came February. February was the second hottest February ever. March, second hottest March ever since we've been recording global temperatures. April, second hottest ever. तब तक आबिद और मैंने भी ट्वीट करना बंद कर दिया था. अब तो आदत पड़ गई ना. हर महीने कौन ट्वीट करेगा? Let's go to something else. There's a singing cat somewhere या कुछ और हुआ होगा. May, hottest May ever. आपको पैटर्न समझ आ गया. June, hottest June ever. July, second hottest July ever. August, second hottest ever. September, hottest ever. October, third hottest ever. November, hottest November ever. December में थोड़ी सी छुट्टी मिली, 8th hottest. I can take you to 2021, the same pattern which you are all now ignoring, as I am ignoring. अब तो अखबार भी रिपोर्ट नहीं करते. ये क्या खबर हुई कि ये hottest है? ऐसे ऐसी पहले भी देखी. Right? Except for the fact that the June that just went was by a wide margin the hottest any month ever recorded. Right? What does this mean? What does this mean? जब एक crisis आती है तो दूसरी crisis छुट्टी भी नहीं चली जाती. Right? What was happening to the climate change? I want to make this. Some of you have heard me say this before. I have made a pledge that now I nearly never make a presentation about climate that is in the future. The mistake I used to make was all my climate graphs were 2050 में ये हो जाएगा, 2070 में ये हो जाएगा. बड़ी वाह वाह होती थी. I've realized I was making a huge mistake because that makes people think as if it's a future issue. हमारे पास time है. Let me show you why we don't have time, why this is a current issue. I hope you can see the picture and I hope you can see those lines. That is actual recorded temperature. This is not what will happen in the future. This is what has been happening. That first red line is the 1.5 the UN talks about, which will not be met. There is no science in the world that you can meet that target. हो ही नहीं सकता. आप जाओ ग्लासगो में जितनी मर्जी आप कलाबाजियां लगाओ. It won't happen. I'm sorry, it's just a science issue. It can't happen. I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong. That is the actual recorded data for every year. We've had data for every month until 2016. I can take it further. 1.5 is certainly going to be breached. 2, unlikely to survive either. लेकिन शायद थोड़ा सा chance हो, लेकिन बहुत ही थोड़ा सा. I really don't think so. I hope I'm wrong. I've spent my whole life wanting to be wrong on this. Now you are sitting there कि अच्छा Professor साहब गल ठीक है दादी, लेकिन I don't live on the planet. I live in Islamabad. Islamabad में it's too cold. Right? So my temperature 0.5, 1.5 to मुझे इतना ज़्यादा नहीं लगता. Let me show you the same data. I put the same data now on a world map. You can choose whatever part of the world map you want. And this is the same data for every year for which data is available across all the places where we've been recording data. Right? नीचे अगर आप पढ़ नहीं सक रहे, so 2020, 2027, 28, the timeline is moving, right? And that's how the color is changing. 1945, 1952, 1963, 1972, 1977. You can see the pattern that's happening. Right? Again, I stop it before today because I'm not interested anymore in telling you what will happen in the future. I'm saying to you, you live in the age of adaptation. अगर आप कराची हैं, you don't need me to tell you there is climate change. You just need to know कि पिछले 8 साल every year you have been having a heat wave. If you are in Thar, you don't need STPI to explain to you that there is climate change because the drought that was supposed to go after 2 years never went. If you are in Lahore, you don't need me or Rafi Alam to tell you that there is climate change. You just need to look outside your window. Right? That's the age of adaptation. And in that age of adaptation, this is how I'm going to relate to COVID in just a minute. The 1.5 target that we were talking about is simply not happening. What does that mean for countries and what does it mean for individuals? आपने अगर ग्लासगो पे तकिया करना है तो करते रहे, दुआ करें, इंशाल्लाह अल्लाह खैर करेगा. लेकिन ये इंशाल्लाह वाले से ना कोविड ठीक होगा ना दूसरी चीजें ठीक होंगी. और ग्लासगो is really like इंशाल्लाह. I'm sorry, जरूर करना चाहिए. We should bank on inshallah and we should bank on COVID. But climate is going to change. It is changing. And therefore, we need, particularly in our water systems, particularly in our agriculture system, particularly in our urban systems, the things that are good for our development themselves. Same with COVID. Now, remember what Ian Bremmer was saying about COVID? One of the things that was most important, I don't know if you call him Ian Bremmer, he said, okay, one of the big surprises is, okay, the difference was not between rich country, poor country. The difference was not between democratic country, undemocratic country. The difference was not between big country, small country. Right? The difference, it turned out, was between well-governed countries and not well-governed countries. Chahe wo autocratic ho ya na. The same is going to be true for climate. It's not going to be a difference between rich, poor. Bangladesh is going to do differently than Pakistan. The difference is going to be those who took it seriously early and those who didn't take it seriously early. Remember in COVID, शुरू में जब दौड़ लगी थी masks के लिए, right? अब तो हर एक जेब में रखता है और 4 गाड़ी में रखता है, 3 घर पे रखता है. The difference is going to be in preparation. That's the lesson from COVID. So if we link these two things I've said as I wrap up, what did COVID teach us, if anything, about climate and about crisis? Right? I would argue that if you think about COVID as a case study in how the world deals with crises, if you think of it as the first big global crisis of your life, and if I am half right, it is baked in another one, at least one more is coming, then what have we learned from this that we might not? I'm just wrapping up. 3 big lessons. 3 slides in the night. 3 big lessons. The first lesson, best up for you. The first victim of COVID, the biggest victim of COVID, the biggest death that happened because of COVID was multilateralism. पहले दिन दफन हो गया था. 70 साल हम कोशिश करते रहे to make a multilateral system of international organizations that are going to deal with international issues. The last time, when was the last time anyone here saw the head of WHO on their television screen? He was a very good guy. It's an institution that does very good work. But probably the last time you saw that was back in April or March when he came and said this is a global pandemic. What happened after that? Everyone for themselves. मास्क लगाओ, एयरपोर्ट बंद करो, इसको इधर ना आने दो, वो मेरे घर ना आए, ये मेरे मुल्क ना आए, तुम उधर नहीं जा सकते. Germany in the EU says to Italy, before there is any case in Germany, we cannot share masks and ventilators. Right? So the single most connected part of the world. Because that's the human reaction. आपकी माँ ने, आपके बाप ने, आपने खुद भी बिल्कुल यही किया था. पहले तो अपने आप को संभालो ना. What we learned was that nations and people behaved exactly to their animal instinct. First, save yourself. And I would bet you, I talked to this about my students, most of us did exactly the same. So the lesson about multilateralism was not a good one. This is not a good lesson for climate. Right? The second lesson is a much more interesting one, science. The great miracle was, I did not expect, most people who work on science, I didn't show you the science slides, science videos, but most people in the beginning did not think we will get a vaccine this quick. People who thought we would get a vaccine this quick did not think we would get a vaccine this effective. It is amazing. It is a major miracle of science. In 10 months, you get a vaccine, you get multiple vaccines, and they are in fact amazingly effective. Right? That's why I'm being able to speak to you right here. Right? That was the great lesson. The bad lesson was we did not want to listen to the science beforehand. The UN was doing simulations for the heads of the G77 6 years ago on pandemic preparation. And yet we were not ready. Right? What the lesson was that while the science is very good at reacting to problems, we as individuals, citizens, are not very good at listening to scientific advice. ये आबिद की आपने कमेटियां सुनी थी, वो उनमें से कोई नहीं सुनता ना. हम एडवाइस दे सकते. We are very good at giving advice. सुनने वाला कोई नहीं है. Right? And that is the lesson. The problem with vaccine as an issue is vaccine diplomacy को तो अभी छोड़ दें. वो तो multilateralism वाला मर गई. Lekin the vaccine lesson is, the problem with that analogy with climate is climate doesn't have a vaccine. Climate can't have a vaccine. It can only have preliminary action, because that's the nature of climate change. The climatic changes are then permanent. It's not like a disease. Finally, and this is the big thing with which I will end, money. Money का तो हमारा basis ही change हो गया. A big number, बड़ा number क्या होता है? Give me a big number. आप बताइए. Billion तो कख नहीं होता. Billion तो छोले होंदे ने. Sorry, but you are right. Like you, I would have said $1 billion is a lot of money, right? ये जो climate वाले हैं, they used to say 100 billion is a lot of money. It will solve problems. One of the lessons we learned in COVID is that when the threat is serious, billion is not what you think. This is a security issue. When people honestly believe that an issue is security, they do not ask the question how much it will cost, which makes sense, right? आप अपनी जान बचाएंगे ना? And that is why climate is not being taken seriously. I don't think people believe in it. Even those who work on it don't. Not to the same way that we did with COVID. Because when a real threat comes, then you don't ask that question. Remember the thing I mentioned before? Let me say that again. 1 week, $1 trillion are printed. Congress ने बात शुरू की, Congress ने बात खत्म की, $1 trillion छप गए. Put into the economy, sent as checks. I'm not talking about impact. I'm talking about real currency notes. Within 9 days, they are spent. You get another tranche. I'm talking about the US. You get another tranche of stimulus checks, $1.5 trillion. Again spent immediately. This is not just the US. It's not कि उनके पास थे. हम दूसरी तरह कर रहे थे. उस level पे नहीं कर रहे थे. China was printing out $1 trillion. The EU was printing out $1.25 trillion. The UK was printing out $700 billion. Right? So हमारा concept of big number to tackle big things changed. And what that means to me is good news. कि यार पैसा है. Seriousness नहीं है. Let me suggest to you कैसे पैसा है. Right? I've been in the US, in Pakistan the last week, so I've been talking and hearing a lot about Afghanistan. And now I smile when people think कि Afghanistan में बड़े पैसे खर्च हुए. Afghanistan was such a cheap war, a cheap date थी. Right? So we keep saying कि 2.4 as if 2.4 trillion बड़ा होता है. Has anyone seen $2.4 trillion? आपके पास है? Here is what 2.26 trillion looks like this. इतने सिफरे होते हैं. Right? That's what 2.26 trillion written out looks like. Let me give you another number. Right? That's the total cost to the US and war in Afghanistan. This is not about war. I'm talking about what happens in economies. Economies, global economy के scale पे जब काम होता है तो होता क्या? 6.25 trillion. That is the total cost of the war on COVID impacts. Now I'm not talking impact on economy. I'm not adding up के हर एक की cost. I'm counting the actual money spent in dollars, in checks, to universities, to people, to other institutions, right? That's how it compares. This is not just this one time, 4.6 trillion. That was the cost to the US of financial crisis. Now, this might look like a depressing slide, but this is my most hopeful slide. The hopeful slide is that if people do take climate seriously, the money will appear. Don't believe anyone who says the money isn't there. If they say the money isn't there, what that means is the will to spend the money isn't there, right? And that's the lesson of COVID. I'm sorry, एक आखिरी slide and then I end. What does this mean for global transformation in the age, global cooperation in the age of transformations? 4 lessons. 1, we need to move, this is for climate, from language of additionality to language of loss and damage, because in some ways, COVID was loss and damage that moved it, right? I'm linking climate and climate. We have to move from development as a problem to development as a solution. What does that mean? Okay, what COVID again recognized, reminded us is okay, how prepared you are for crisis is more important than how big you are, how democratic you are, how rich you are, and so on and so forth. And that's development. You need to move, especially again, I'm trying to link this to climate, from discussions of not just international justice, but to local justice. The point I was saying about how it is changing the workplace. And even those of us who think we are victims are making victims of others in that. And finally, we need to move from thinking about national costs to thinking about global commons and global benefits. I'm sorry I've taken too long and I've put a lot at you. मैं जब भी पाकिस्तान आता हूँ मुझे हौका होता है कि सारी बातें एक साथ कर दो. But thank you everyone for being here. Time for questions. Do we have some? Huh? Sorry, मैंने बहुत लंबी बात कर दी है, but I would like to take some questions. Maybe we can collect a few. Anyone? Ji sir.
Thank you, Dr. Saab, for knowledgeable and wonderful information given to us. My name is Sajid Hussain Malik, worked as senior researcher and legal advisor to Azad Jammu and Kashmir Council. My question is, and I will speak in Urdu, कि ये जो कोरोना है ये चाइना से शुरू हुआ और यूएस के प्रेसिडेंट ने कहा था कि हम अपना वफद भेजेंगे, वो इंक्वायरी करेगा कि इसमें ये क्यों शुरू हुआ, क्या नहीं हुआ. फिर उसके बाद नहीं पता चला कि उसकी रीज़न क्या थी. दूसरा, ये जो मास्क हैं, ये मैं आर्टिकल पढ़ रहा था, ये टनों के हिसाब से समुद्रों में से डाले गए और लाइफ जो है समुद्रों की, वो बेचारों की बहुत अफेक्ट हो रही है. तो इस पे भी गौर करना चाहिए इंटरनेशनल कम्युनिटी को. Again, thank you very much. Your second lecture, I was.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me take a few more and then I'll add them up. Anyone else?
First of all, thank you for your insightful lecture.
Sorry, yaar, bada lamba ho gaya tha, but thank you.
This is Amjad Hussain, advocacy officer at SDPI and also student of politics and international relations. Sir, as you said that there are always some winners and losers of every crisis. So here I see that the winners of these crises is again the global north, because these crises have taken us to a new arena of digital imperialism, digital data imperialism, and even the imperialism of climate change. So how do you see that this crisis even given more leverage to the global north than the global south? Thank you.
Maybe one more. Maybe one more in the room and then we'll take those.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Najam. Always a pleasure to be listening to your lectures. My question is basically about how you mentioned globalization is a problem and quite adds to climate change. And of course, given the current scenario, while there are a lot of countries, like you mentioned during Donald Trump's time, that a lot of countries are moving towards nationalism, but still globalization will not be able to be eradicated because of the dependency of countries upon others. So I just wanted to request you if you can just shed some light on how we can better govern globalization in the current scenario, that it is more conducive to the climate as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Let me take those three and then if there are others we will. Sir, वो वफ्त वाला और क्या हमें पता लगा कि क्यों शुरू हुआ और कैसे शुरू हुआ. मैं प्रैक्टिकल किस्म का आदमी हूँ, तो अगर आप मुझे इजाजत दे बुरा ना मानिएगा, लेकिन माय थॉट इज पता लग जाता तो की कर लेना. ठीक है, पता लग जाएगा कभी ना कभी, लेकिन ट्रंप साहब तो नंबर बना रहे थे कि मैं नहीं किता, उन्हें किता, लेकिन उस वाली पॉलिटिक्स वो ठीक है, आई एम वेरी इंटरेस्टेड इन दैट एज एन एकेडमिक, बट दैट्स द नेचर ऑफ disease and that's the nature of vector disease. Right now, the things I've talked about previously in this lecture, for example, many have heard that one of the threats of climate change again is the increase of vector-borne disease. Now, I'm not saying corona is because of that, लेकिन जब ये आफतें आती हैं तो ये पूछना कि क्यों आई हैं is less important, at least to me as a policy person, than करना क्या, right? And that's where I would link to yours. I don't agree. I'm not sure कि ये ठीक है, हमें शौक भी होता है कि चौधरी का कसूर है, मेरा नहीं है, मैं जो मर्जी कह दूं, मौसम खराब है तो वो अमेरिका ने किया है, मेरी जॉब चली गई तो वो चीन ने किया होगा. I know you are not saying that. मुझे इजाजत दें कि थोड़ा सा मैं आपकी वाली बात को मोड़ लूं, लेकिन अगर मोड़ने की आदत है, so yes, there are winners. They're not always winners and losers. Climate में या COVID में there may be those who lose more and those who lose less, right? लेकिन I don't think it's as simple as कि चौधरी साहब फिर जीत गए, right? वो एक पुरानी कहानी है कि वो जंगल में जो था ना, वो एक दो थे, लड़ रहे थे जानवर, तो एक उनके पास कुछ चीजें थी बांटने को, they weren't able to figure out how to distribute it. So मेरे जो एक बंदर आ गया, बंदर ने आके कहा यार I'll help you distribute it, right? वो जो भी चीजें थी उसने कहा one for you, two for me, one for you, two for me, right? So there is this mindset that the bandar always wins, right? The big guy always wins. One of the things I think COVID told us is that's not necessarily true. I think अगर मैंने कोई radical बात की है तो वो ये की है, it's not the big that always wins. It is not the rich who always wins. It is not the powerful who always wins. It is the prepared who always wins. मैं इसलिए कह रहा हूं, मैं जहां से आया हूं ना, जितने आज पूरे पाकिस्तान में कोविड केस होंगे उससे ज्यादा उस शहर में है जहां मैं रहता हूं, अमेरिका में, राइट? सो इधर हमारे, मुझे नहीं पता नंबर कितने सही है कितने गलत है, बट देयर इज समथिंग हैपनिंग. जब वो किस वजह से हुई, प्रिपेयर्डनेस की वजह से हुई या हमारी बॉडी की प्रिपेयर्डनेस की वजह से हुई कि हमें वी आर मोर इम्यून और व्हाटएवर, बट द लेसन इज कि दो सिंपल फ्रेमवर्क्स जिस पे हम तकिया करके बैठे हुए थे जी, मैं क्योंकि मेरा प्रॉब्लम जो है ना वो आपकी एनालिसिस से नहीं है, थॉट प्रोसेस से, इसलिए जो मैं ट्विस्ट कर रहा हूं वो ये है कि इफ वी कन्विंस आवरसेल्व्स कि द बिग गाय ऑलवेज विंस, ग्लोबल नॉर्थ विल ऑलवेज विन, रिच विल ऑलवेज विन, then the logical corollary of that is कि there is no point in me trying. उन्हें तो वैसे ही जित जाना. Right, so a fatalism comes out of that, which I think has been a major problem of the developing countries. Right, in fact, I think in climate negotiations that's been a problem. There is this sense कि जो करेगा वो चौधरी करेगा, जो करेगा वो शेर करेगा, मैं क्या करना है. Right, I'm sorry I keep going into Punjabi, but the point I'm making is कि COVID is one of those examples where it doesn't fall into the pattern. There is we should be interested why New Zealand ended up differently than the US. We should be interested why Germany and Austria within Europe ended up differently than Spain. Spain doing better at least now, and so on and so forth. And that question, I hope, and from this seems to suggest that what matters is not simply our usual fault lines, but this fault line of good governance. Ab nara ban gaya na, isliye I don't want to use it, but places that worked well, where systems worked, seemed to do better. Places that were prepared seems to do better. Places where politics was stable seem to do better. आपने तस्वीरें देखी हैं of the US, right? Now, US didn't have dearth of money. I just gave you the numbers. But the politics was so divided. This is a lesson for Pakistan. हमारी politics भी अच्छी खासी divided है ना. Places where politics was divided ended up having to pay that cost. Right? We saw that also in our neighborhood. So I'm trying to make a serious point here. In some ways, I would urge us to think about the new lesson here, which might be that. On the globalization thing, I think you're right, except I would again say, I think you mean it that way, but let me say that it's not like globalization is dead. No one says that, right? Like democracy, COVID has enhanced the need to rethink what it is. One of the things it did in terms of globalization is, it is clear actually, which wasn't clear back in January. In January, there were people who were kind of believing Trump and the Trump sort of idea. It wasn't just Trump, it was the Brexit idea. Okay, maybe we will be better off without globalization. One of the things that COVID did was it pointed out that actually there is no way out of globalization. You can't unwind globalization. It can change, it can create losers, but it's not like a switch which you can turn off. Right? The first thing that happened was with the masks. We don't remember it now because masks are up to most bante hain puri duniya mein. But remember how right at the beginning the thing was whether I can get a mask or not, right? Even in the US. So what in terms of globalization, it demonstrated that there isn't a way out of it. Even though it also had demonstrated already that the current system wasn't totally working, right? With Danny Roderick, who you saw there, has written elsewhere that the problem with globalization is that the assumption was that rising tides will lift all ships or all boats. It turns out that globalization lifts some boats and not others, right? So globalization is up for grabs. I'll give you another one, and then we'll end or maybe take another round if we have time. But right at the beginning of COVID, there was this belief even among some of my folks what it will do is we will move from global manufacturing to much more local manufacturing, right? ये जो हमने just in time पे depend करते हैं कि the global movements are so smooth that I can get my adrak from China or other things and they will come there right in time. So initially when the sea lanes and the supply chains became a problem, there was a sense, okay, the shift that will happen is local manufacturing. I think now, 18 months into it, it's clear that can't happen, right? Those costs can't. So we have to find a new piece with globalization, just as we have to find a new piece with democracy. Zara, are we out of time or do we have time for a few? In time, we can take a few questions? Ji. What is the best solution for the small? What करें? Quickest तो यही है. Best वाले के लिए नहीं, jokes apart, he had who was the person? I don't want to. I hope I don't offend people with this. नहीं, पर दुआ करना वैसे भी अच्छा है. There isn't quick solutions because you cause problems slowly and then you have to live with them, and this is going to be true for many climate change. I honestly think that rather than asking me, the person to ask is Rafi Ahmed and others who have been working on it. Rafi I mentioned in particular because he's been mentioning for multiple years कि यार सारे solution हमें पता है. In fact, they are even in government documents. And we in a way, smog इसलिए अच्छा topic है कि it's a solvable problem. COVID is a very difficult problem, as your question pointed out. But smog is really a solvable problem. Scientifically, economically, structurally, it's a solvable problem. A, because we know the science. B, because we know the tools. C, because others have done it. Los Angeles used to be this place जहाँ वो दूर से आपको जो है एक स्टेट दूर से उसकी smog नजर आती थी, and they were able to do it. So we know some of those things. What are some of those things? And again, I would refer to people like Rafi and others who work very deeply on it. But part of it is your fuel, both the quantity and the quality. Part of the answer lies in your refineries and what goes into the fuel. That again is a solvable problem at manageable costs. Policy का ये हर problem solvable होता है, but this is solvable at manageable costs, which is about additives into your fuel. So what is where you are using the fuel? आप रिक्शे में क्या है और आपकी गाड़ी में क्या है? And part of that is your and my responsibility, right? गाड़ी तो मैं चला रहा हूँ ना, and how much we use. So that's part of it. Part of it is the brick kilns and the bhatta. A number of things are being done on that, including, for example, when you use them, when you don't use them, where you move them, how do you change them. The bhatta question used to be a child labor question. Now it's also an urban pollution question. And the largest one is just the urban design. Right? And this is a Karachi problem, this is a Lahore problem. So I don't have specific answers to that, but I think smog is a good one. In a way, हमने unfortunately, I think too many people have kind of resigned to the fact that this is the 5th season. बाकी सूबों में 4 सीजन होते हैं, पंजाब में 5 होंगे. And this pains me personally. मेरे इस ट्रिप का जो सबसे बड़ा दुख है वो ये है कि I couldn't go to Lahore. I was supposed to, I had planned to, eventually had to change the meeting क्योंकि आपको पता नहीं था कि आप पहुंचेंगे. And in some ways, if we get used to that, that's terrible. So there is a fog issue, which is a climatic reality. The smog issue is not a climatic reality. The smog is really कि आप fog लेते हैं, उसमें आप smoke डाल देते हैं, उनको मिला देते हैं, और जो शरबत बनता है उसको आप smog कह देते हैं, right? So if that's the science, then the science of cleaning it up is you reduce the smoke that is going into it. How do you do it? Again, leaving the technical stuff aside, you reduce your consumption. That's partly your and my responsibility. And then the policy responsibility is what is adding to the fuel and what is adding to the bhatta. And the third thing is, I think also, which is very important, is the information part, right? Simply, and वो होनी शुरू हो गई है, अब आप AQI को report करते हैं. दुख होता है कई बार. I don't want to make political statements, but इस पे होता है दुख. I heard recently कि Punjab EPA is going to change the definition of AQI ताकि नंबर छोटा हो जाए. नंबर छोटे होने से स्मॉग छोटी नहीं हो जाती, स्मॉग उधर ही रहती है, right? So it's an important question. Last question here. I don't know if it's a question, but I'm guessing that someone is talking about maybe the West or the US. My again sort of general request and response would be that I personally, academically, I'm interested in initiator कौन था, लेकिन ये initiator कोई नहीं होता. और इस वाले में नहीं है. If the COVID virus hadn't started from China, it would have started from somewhere else. The think कि हमने blame किसको करना है is not going to help on this one. उसको समझ लेना जरूरी चाहिए so that we can, समझने का reason ये होना चाहिए कि how will we deal with the next ones. One thing is pretty clear: COVID isn't going to go away, right? And when people say that, it's very interesting. Whether it's here or in the US, people usually mean that some new variant of COVID will come, which is clear, right? I'm not a public health expert, लेकिन I've now spoken to enough public health इसके अलावा भी कि the logic is pretty clear. When people say COVID isn't going to go away, it's not कि कोई नया variant आ जाएगा, वो भी होगा, लेकिन other types of viruses will come. Virus is a historical reality. There is a good news in what I've said. Maybe I'll end with this. There is a good news in what has happened. The fact is कि हम COVID के बारे में आज बात कर रहे हैं. You are able to sit there. I am able to travel and come and talk to you here. That is a miracle. पहले भी आए ना, उनका तरीका सिर्फ ये था कि फिर लोग मर जाते थे, जो रह जाते थे वो फिर दुनिया स्टार्ट कर देते थे, right? So in some ways, let us not undermine the miracle of science that allowed you this. I don't know आप लोग यहाँ ज़्यादा young लोग हैं, which is very nice, but जो मेरी उम्र वाला अगर कोई है, तो मेरी नानी हमेशा कहती थी कि फलाना जो था ना वो हैजे में मर गया. And I remember joking कि 2-3 के बाद कितनों को हैजा हुआ था, ये हर एक को हैजा क्यों होता था, man, which is a silly and stupid joke. But in retrospect, what I found was कि वो जो कहानियां होती थी जो हमारी नानियां दादी सुनाती थी, that was about the Spanish flu. Right? And when the Spanish flu hit what was then British India, people didn't know there was a pandemic. Right? So the point I'm trying to make, I hope I don't do it insensitively, but the point I'm trying to make is that we should be grateful for the scientific time we live in, but that also gives us the responsibility to be more caring and the responsibility to learn better. And to me, it's not a question. I don't think it's as simple कि किसी ने बनाया और उन्होंने बुरा किया. It goes back to that thing I was saying. कि I think as individuals and developing countries, we need to get out of this. If it is that, I'm not suggesting it is. लेकिन कई बार हमें नजर आता है कि वो there's a victim sense कि मेरी सारी मुसीबतें किसी और ने बनाई. मेरी नानी जो थी ना, मैंने ये पहले भी बात की हुई है, फिर कह मेरी नानी बड़ी अक्लमंद थी. नानियां सारी अक्लमंद होती हैं, नानों के बारे में कुछ नहीं पता, दादों के बारे में, बट वो कहती है कि एक उंगली किसी की तरफ करोगे तो तीन अपनी तरफ होगी. Right? So I do think in a way, as policy as well as individuals, this idea that our issues are being created by someone else, even if it is true, let's say वो सब true है, उससे फायदा कोई नहीं होगा ना. फायदा तो इससे होगा कि we do something about our issues. And I think COVID gives us an opportunity to learn from it and try doing something. If I leave you with any message, if there is one, it is this issue that once again we are reminded that preparedness pays. And I hope we will learn that lesson from COVID and also apply it with climate change and other things. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone here today. Thank you for taking the time to join us like physically, and those participants who have joined us online. I'm really convinced that COVID-19 has changed the amplitude and the frequency of the whole universe. And despite a lot of, we are standing, I think so, nowhere in a sense, but like all the things has changed, but we are really looking forward for the positive change and the sustainable furniture. That's the agenda of today's lecture by Dr. Professor Adil Najam. Thank you so much for a great and interesting lecture. Thank you. I'm really grateful to Institute of Regional Studies for providing this platform. So here we are. As always, coffee, tea, and water is available for you upstairs. We welcome you to join us. Thank you so much.